When your boundary walls collapse and your brain wakes up, what happens? I'm happy to welcome all of you to this fairly informal and intimate video, which contains thoughts that woke up by themselves when last night, due to the very heavy rains in Kerala, my boundary walls behind the house collapsed with a huge crashing noise. The noise hit me hard last night, and I couldn't figure out what the noise was due to. But it was so dark and so wet, I couldn't venture out of my house and find out what was what this rather alarming noise was due to. So I waited till morning, and then when I looked at the compound, I noticed a heap of bricks and concrete, plaster, and then I realized that my boundary walls, abutting two plots behind my house, had collapsed. I stood there for a brief while and my brain began to work. And a flood of thoughts came rushing in. And in this video, I'm trying to share with you some of those thoughts to the accompaniment of the rain, which has lightened a little bit, but is still there to provide the background music. So, what did I think, or what are the thoughts that woke up in my mind as I saw the boundary walls behind my house collapse in a heap? The first thought, and perhaps the main thought, and that's what I would like to concentrate on and develop, pertain to the very idea of the boundary wall. What is a boundary wall? Now, in my case, did it exist as a boundary wall or something more than a boundary wall? For example, up until the time the boundary wall collapsed, I didn't realize, or I didn't have a clear idea about who was living behind the boundary wall. My boundary wall was very high, not necessarily because the wall itself was very high, but because my house stands on something of a hillside, and the houses built behind my house are on a much higher level, and therefore the boundary wall that separates my house from the two houses abutting my plot is naturally high, and it hides the two houses behind my house completely. So it is not deliberate, it is a byproduct of the geography or the topography of the area. But yesterday, when the boundary wall collapsed, I could see both houses. And for the first time, actually, I realized with some happiness that I have neighbors behind me. So the irony of the boundary wall collapsing is that it made me happy to realize that there are two neighboring houses, two families living behind me, which I, of course, I was aware of, but the experience of that reality after the collapse of the boundary wall was completely different. And I don't know if I can really transmit to you the real flavor of the thought that I'm dealing with at the present time. So this I thought was something very interesting. From there, my mind went to another idea. What indeed is a boundary wall? And in what sense is a boundary wall different from a limit? A limit. Is a boundary wall a limit? Or what's the difference between a boundary wall and a limit? Now, I tried to imagine this idea in my mother tongue, Malayalam, and initially I found it very difficult to be clear in terms of the words to be used, diction. But gradually, some clarity dawned on me, and therefore, if I were to do this video in Malayalam, I would be able to do it and retain some degree of clarity on the thought process itself. Now, let's therefore try and understand what's the difference between a boundary and a limit. Now, in the case of a boundary, there is a recognition that there is something beyond the boundary. You may wall yourself in and try to sort of exclude what is beyond the boundary, but a boundary wall is a boundary wall only if there are people living beyond the wall that you build. And therefore, I realized with some degree of happiness that it's the people living beyond the boundary that I erect that make the boundary wall a boundary wall. Otherwise, I cannot build a boundary wall but for the people who live beyond the boundary wall. So, a boundary wall is not just my creation alone, even if I am the person who is investing all the money, meeting all the expenses in building up this boundary wall. Now, if there is nobody living beyond my boundary wall, it's not a boundary wall, it's a limit. Limit is that beyond which I cannot go. A boundary wall is that beyond which I have to go. I have to relate to the people living beyond. But because I came into this area as an outsider, I was not born and brought up here. I'm a kind of outsider living in Trivandrum. And because I came in a fairly advanced stage in terms of age in my life, and because this wall was so high that it shut out the human presence altogether, I have to say that though I've lived here for almost 9 years, I was completely impervious to the presence of two families behind my backyard. And therefore, nature did its work last night and brought the two walls down, creating in me this new awareness, this new carnival of awareness. Or if I may use an idiom based on Greek mythology, a Saturnalia of awareness. A Saturnalia, Saturnalia. Just look up. A Saturnalia of awareness. A Saturnalia of awareness means a carnival, a festival of awareness about the fact that there are two neighboring families. I'm richer for that. So there's a difference, very substantial difference between a boundary wall and a limit. It is illegal, it is uncivil, impertinent to go beyond the limit. So when two people are you're talking with somebody and that person takes too much liberties with you, would say, don't cross the limit. You don't cross the limit. Or using the Indian mythological idiom, don't cross the Lakshman Rekha. That's the limit, beyond which you cannot go. Boundary is beyond which you have to go and establish human contact, enriching human contact with the people who live beyond the boundary wall. But unfortunately, in modern times, as I've already said in one of my videos, because of this deification or cultification of the autonomous, self-sufficient individual, which resulted in the creation of this atomized society, the sense of neighborhood has been atrophied, and I am myself a victim of that because all my working life I spent in a metropolis where the sense of neighborhood is absolutely absent. Unless you make a very special effort to create some kind of neighborliness, even if you are living only 9 inches away from another family in a multi-storied building, you don't feel that that family is your neighbor unless both families make the effort to create a sense of neighborliness, which rarely happens. So, this has actually resulted in the impoverishment of our life. And today, I'd like to share with you a poem which deals with this. And it's a very famous poem, and therefore it's easy to share that with you. It is titled Mending Wall, and it is by an English poet called Robert Frost. Most of you remember that he was very uh, greatly appreciated by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. And Nehru was particularly attracted by the four lines in a poem that Robert Frost wrote. And the title of that poem is Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. And those words, uh, uh, just to remind ourselves, are like this: I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And of course, then he goes on to say that I have miles to go before I sleep, and I have miles to go before I sleep, etc., etc. So that is Robert Frost. Now, the poem that I want to share with you today, which has direct bearing on my immediate experience of seeing my boundary wall collapse in a heap, and therefore enabling me to discover my two neighbors. Now, that poem is Mending Wall by Robert Frost. I'm just going to read that poem without stop and then maybe revisit the poem to make one or two observations. So let's have the poem. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair where they have left not one stone on a stone. But they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps, I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made. But at spring mending time, we find them there. I let my neighbors know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go. We rebuild the broken wall, mend the walking wall as we go. To each the boulders that have fallen to each, and some are lows and some nearly bald. Some stones are lows, flat stones, some are bald, some are round. We have to use a spell to make them balance. It's very difficult to make them stay where they are placed. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game. On, on, one on a side. It comes to little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. Where the wall stands, actually, we do not need the wall. He is all pine and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never go across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I would ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that bonds it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only and the shade of trees. He will not go beyond his father's saying, good friends make good neighbors. So that's the point. Now, to recapitulate the physical details of the poem, the poet and his neighbor. And there is a wall that separates their two compounds. And what happens to this stone wall? When springtime comes, due to some mysterious force in action, the walls break down. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that spills the upper boulders in the sun. What that something is, what is that particular force which causes the walls to break, making it necessary for them to repair it routinely? What is that force? It's not because of the activity of hunters. Hunters come and ferret certain parts of the wall in order to bring out the rabbits. to please their helping dogs. Helping is barking dogs. No, no, it's not because of the activity of the hunters. I've come after them and I've repaired whatever damage they caused. I've repaired myself. This one is not because of the activity of hunters. It's something else. What is that something? And then, of course, the poet is trying to come to terms with it. He says, I am all apple, he is all pine. There is no danger that my apple should go across and eat his pine cones. So, therefore, there is really no practical need for the wall between us. I have no cows. If I had cows, you could have said that my cows would go across the boundary and eat his pine cones. All I have is some apple trees. My apples will not walk across and cause any harm in his compound. Then why should there be a wall between us? But when I raised this question with him while we were working together, working hard, wearing our fingers rough with carrying the stones, handling the stones, he only says good friends make good friends because he heard this aphorism, this apothegm said by his father. His father has handed down to him this apothegm or this aphorism or this proverb, if you like. What's that proverb? What's that wise saying? Good fences make good neighbors. If there is no fence between you and I, we'll quarrel all the time. If you build a fence, then our friendship can be protected. So good fences make good neighbors. This is something that he has heard his father say, and he accepted it as a proverb, a wise saying, and therefore he holds on to it even when there is no need for it. So the poet says we need to look at some of these assumptions which are handed down to us as wise sayings from the past, which we then wield like stones irrespective of the context. So even if there is no need for a wall, we will erect the wall because we have heard our forefathers say good fences make good neighbors. But this is against the law of nature. Nature wills that human beings live without walls, or more particularly, nature wills that human beings do not confuse between walls and limits. Let nothing inherited stand in the way of our using our common sense. This is not to say that whatever we have inherited is nonsense. No, tremendous treasures have been inherited. But in the way we use those treasures, sometimes we make those treasures means of tragedies. Instead of making them a source of enrichment in our life, we use them and abuse them in such a manner that they become hindrances. So, the neighbor to the poet says, good fences make good friends. So, therefore, let's keep the walls well mended, even if there is no need for the wall. So, this poem actually has become quite famous. In fact, it's one of the most famous poems of Robert Frost. And I've heard this poem quoted in several political discussions by political philosophers, particularly raising the question that actually goes back. The person who originated this question, the original source of this question was the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who challenged people to think of the difference between boundaries and limits. And I've used that treasure of thought in this video. So that I have to acknowledge, in the interest of intellectual honesty, I have to acknowledge Immanuel Kant as the fountain spring of my thoughts in this context, but it's occasioned by an immediate personal experience. And therefore, there is a touch of freshness about it. So I thought I would share these reflections rising from an immediate personal experience. You can still hear the rains. For the last 3 days, it's been raining in a very sustained manner. Sometimes the rain intensifies, sometimes it lightens, as is the case now. I have to say that Kerala looks like a beautifully dressed up bride, beautifully adorned bride during the monsoon season. I like Kerala most during the monsoon season. This is the season for me. It's a wonderful time. So even if I have to pay for it with my boundary wall, and now the strain and the stress of having to rebuild the boundary wall, and having to carry the burden of the economic cost it entails, in spite of all that, I still feel happy that my boundary wall has collapsed in two places, revealing to me in a very clear fashion that I've got two families living behind me. And I look forward to making friends with them, though I'm also realistic enough to know that nobody really wants to make friends with old people. No? As you can see, that the reactions, that the adverse or hostile reactions that they provoke from people through some of my videos, every one of them says, "You're an old man, you're an old fool. Why don't you shut up and stay quiet in the corner of your in a corner of your room?" So that is the attitude of people by and large, and therefore nobody would be particularly eager to make friends with me. Therefore, I hope and pray that I succeeded my effort to make friends with my neighbors. So thank you very much. And the point I want to make is that every experience in our life can be food for thought. And even if there is a famine in the land regarding the food for the stomach, we can still have enough food for thought, and that's a wonderful and reassuring thing. Thank you, and have a blessed day.